Hi, everybody. Thank you again for joining ASMGi's latest cybersecurity webinar. We're going to get started right now. We have a lot of ground to cover. I'd like to introduce Steve Racing, President and CEO of ASMGi. Go ahead, Steve.
Thanks, Paul, and thanks all of you for sharing some of your time with us today. And thanks, Tom, for being here today. We have a great topic. So we're going to talk about extended IoT or XIoT, which is I'll say a newer term, and we'll make sure that gets defined in the spirit of the alphabet soup that we all have to deal with every day. But we're going to talk about that level of security. So we have a lot of material to cover, so I'll get started very quickly. I'm Steve Racing, President and CEO of ASMGi. I actually have a background in process control, so I'm familiar with device, level stuff. I own a hard hat and steel-toed boots, so that's pretty cool, and I'm very comfortable in that environment. But what we'll learn today is that it really extends past that, and I'm very excited to have you with us, Tom, and maybe you can tell us a little bit about yourself. You're muted, by the way.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Steve. I'm Tom Pace. I'm the co-founder and CEO of NetRise. I guess most relevant to this conversation is I worked at Department of Energy for 3 years doing industrial control system security. I then left there and worked at Cylance for around 4.5 years, where I was doing things from incident response to industrial control systems consulting. I was also overseeing our IoT firmware and embedded systems work there. So all of that kind of collective experience helped inform kind of what we're doing now, especially my time at the Department of Energy. And prior to all that, I was in the Marine Corps. I was an enlisted infantryman running around the Middle East for a couple of years. So yeah, it's been a good run so far.
Awesome. Tell us a little bit about NetRise as well.
Yeah, so NetRise is we are a company that is focused on providing visibility and risk identification to a class of devices that historically have had none. So as we kind of go in and start talking about what XIoT is, it's an umbrella term that covers various other kinds of devices, such as IoT, industrial control systems, medical devices, embedded systems in vehicles, satellites, telecommunications equipment, et cetera. And so what we do, the way in which we provide that visibility and risk identification, unlike anybody else, is by analyzing the firmware, which needs to get uploaded to the platform. And so once that happens, we identify the software components, we identify vulnerabilities, certificates, we do binary analysis, et cetera, et cetera. And then we provide all of the results to that in a very human consumable platform that people can then take action on those items.
Well, we're going to drill into that a little bit today, and I really appreciate having your wisdom at the table today. So we'll have a great discussion.
I appreciate it.
From an agenda standpoint, some of the things we'll talk about, the introduction and session overview are done. We'll share a little general information about XIoT, and then some specific questions, Tom, that we can have a discussion around. And today's really intended to be a discussion. So please chime in anytime. If you're in the audience, feel free to chime in and use the question Q&A box if possible. And then we'll actually have an opportunity for the audience to ask various questions, and then some closing remarks and announcements. So I want to get started with exactly what you started to address, Tom. What is XIoT anyway? I mean, it's what is encompassed by that term?
Yeah, so extended IoT or XIoT is a term that was coined by Clarity, to the best of my understanding. I reached out to them and made sure that was the case. I think the rationale for them coming up with this was as a result of the Medigate acquisition. So they were no longer just doing ICS and OT, which was their primary focus in the past. That's why their company's name is Clarity, with an OT in there. And so they kind of needed another way to represent these class of devices that they're covering. So that's where this came from. If we look at what we have, you have IoT for Internet of Things, you have OT for operational technology, you have ICS for industrial control systems, you have IIoT, which is industrial Internet of Things. You have like med dev, or IoMT for Internet of Medical Things. I mean, so you have all of these other terms. And so I think the desire was to take all of that collection of these individual things and have them funnel up to one term that encompasses all of those things.
Right.
And so that was the goal and purpose there that I think they achieved well. I mean, we're all tired of more acronyms in cybersecurity, like there's no doubt about it, especially for those of us who've like worked in the government or been in the military. But I do appreciate this one, I guess, more so than many of the others, in the sense that it allows me to not have to ramble on around all these different acronyms and just point to one. Right. So that's the
and
advantage.
I think that's the benefit of it. It encompasses, you know, there's a lot of breadth in what it encompasses. So I did want to share. Gartner actually, they have a slightly different term, but it's very similar and very relevant in that it encompasses a lot of things, but cyber physical systems. And that's what Gartner basically coins it. And that's the way that they chose to describe it. But they make a premise that by 2024, 75% of CEOs will be personally liable for any CPS, cyber physical systems incidents, which is incredibly scary, right? When we think about, you know, these networks of extended IoT devices that are out there, and there's just tons of vulnerabilities in them, and the board and the C-suite being, you know, liable for any incidents that occur as a result of that. It's a scary time for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's probably a bit aggressive on that timetable. Otherwise, no one will become a CEO of any of these companies. The liability would be like, what's the whole point of having protections as like from like a board perspective and things like that, if you're just going to go to jail for doing the best you can? Now, if you have like gross negligence, if you knew about something and didn't fix it, sure, but that's been the case forever. So, you know, what I do think here is that there is certainly, I think maybe what they're getting at is they are highlighting that there is a significant opportunity for improvement when it comes to cyber physical systems, and that in general, we don't appropriately understand the risk associated with these devices, which I
putting your head in the sand is not an option in this case, right? So,
and that's what a lot of organizations are doing. And I also think that, to play devil's advocate even to myself, I suppose, people have not had a solution that is able to give them the visibility and accurate risk identification of these products in the first place. So what have they had that has been able to give this to them? Because the current solutions in the market now, especially for the enterprise, are not adequate. And that doesn't mean they're bad. It just means they're not built for this.
Right.
So, you know, I'm sure we'll talk more about that.
The premise I've always made, like you've heard people talk about a smart toaster being on the horizon, right? Maybe there is, I don't know.
Oh, there's definitely a smart.
There's smart everything, right? So, but that said, is if the bad guys look at that as a way in, right? But it's connected to the IT network. So the toaster itself there may not be any sensitive data that resides on the toaster or anything of value to the bad guys, but they can leverage the vulnerabilities that exist on the toaster to get to and get into the network, and then traverse to the IT network where the sensitive data lives and those kind of things. So I think it's a real problem, and I think it's moving up the food chain from an attack surface perspective.
No, that's right. That's really the point. So, you know, there's a lot of research out there about this. And so, but I'll give a few examples of a couple things. Conservatively, let's say you have 1,000 laptops, desktop servers. Conservatively, you have 1,000 XIoT devices. So your attack surface is at least the same as your enterprise attack surface at a minimum. And so what does that include? Routers, switches, VPNs, security appliances, physical access controls, printers, security cameras, if I mentioned that already, access points, like all of the other stuff that we don't think about, building automation systems, HVAC, thermostats, all these things. That is an attack surface. And I can go back and talk about 5 million breaches and incidents that have been caused from third-party risk. If
we're going to talk about a few things coming up here, Tom, so hold that thought. But I did want to mention that, like, the pervasiveness of IoT devices. So this is what I like about a term like XIoT is that it just encompasses so many different things, but there's a statistic, there are a lot of statistics around this, but the proliferation and growth of the market for IoT devices is just huge. And I think what characterizes a device as a device is that there's no operating system, right? There's firmware, but maybe you can elaborate a little bit specifically on, what it is and
Yeah. I mean, there is an operating system, right? I mean, it's, we say that a lot, like, so a lot of these things are, you break these devices from an operating system into two categories, really. You have embedded Linux, and then you have real-time operating systems. So real-time operating systems can be something like VxWorks, FreeRTOS, Green Hills, QNX, things like that. They're very much smaller, much more performance like restrictive, and all typically for like safety critical systems and things like that. But for especially the embedded Linux things, I mean, it's just Linux at the end of the day. Now, is it stripped down? Sure. Is it the exact same thing as an Ubuntu image? No. But is it very similar? Yep. Like the same techniques that you would leverage to evaluate the security of like a Linux server can be leveraged in firmware. Now, that's an overgeneralization, of course, but that gives you like some frame of reference. Real-time operating systems, much different problem. That's much more challenging. A real-time operating system can literally just be a single binary. And so sure, you can do some static and dynamic analysis on that, but emulation becomes more important in terms of understanding what is happening with that operating system, so you can see what's actually occurring. Because once that thing starts running, it spins up a bunch of other things, and without that visibility, it's hard to get an accurate representation of the risk, which is what our primary goal is. So
cool. So let's talk about some general information. And for all intent purposes, some of the things we've been talking about, as you could say, is general information. But I pulled a couple of examples, and I got these actually from NetRise, so you'll be very familiar with them. But they're very interesting because I think a lot of people generally don't think of them as an XIoT device, right? And so, in my opinion, it's about identifying risks across the organization. It doesn't matter what it is, right? But if it's an XIoT device, there's a very specialized set of risks that are pervasive, right? And so, but cameras is an area where, it used to be there was a closed CCTV network, and they were all on coaxial cable, and they're air gap. That's a term that we hear a lot in operational technology, right? So they were separated from the IT network or the business network. But today, most cameras, they have firmware on them, and then they connect to a switch with Ethernet, right? So that you can, exploit those vulnerabilities to get to some. But maybe you can elaborate a little bit on, on this specifically. And this example is great. Like 150,000 connected cameras were exploited basically because of a vulnerability, right? And the bad guys they're finding these things, right? They'll find this way in. It's like not locking the door, right?
No, that's right. I mean, all of these connected devices are potential entry points. And I mean, a lot of these cameras aren't even connected using Ethernet, right? They're just connected over wireless. Like they just connect to whatever the nearest wireless access point is. Which allows, that's the whole point, that these things are much easier to implement, they're easier to manage, they're easy to administer. Companies have made adopting and relying on IoT like so easy, it's really hard to ignore and go with like a traditional solution for these kind of things, because it's so much harder to administrate and manage and implement. So yeah, I mean, this is just one example here where they were able to gain access and basically look inside. I think one of the famous images that came out of this was from like a Tesla factory, where they could see inside, like watching like Teslas being manufactured and things like that. I don't think there was any like wildly sensitive information from that particular camera, but obviously
most industries use cameras, and I think the challenge can be framed up. We all think of a camera as a very simplistic device, right? And that's probably a mistake in this case, because it's not a simplistic device, and the bad guys have already figured out how to exploit it. So it's
just a computer. we really need to stop thinking about these devices as not computers, because that's what they are.
Right.
Now, the key difference is, right? I mean, there's not a keyboard, there's not a mouse, there's not a monitor, there's not a user interacting with it all of the time. But then on the opposite side of that, you don't have anywhere near the same level of visibility as to what's going on. You can't install an agent. You can't impact, you can't update these things
Right.
like arbitrarily. You have to wait for the manufacturer to push a firmware update to you, which might come once every 6 months or 12 months or something like that. So it's a totally different paradigm, that solutions that address a totally different paradigm don't really exist.
Yeah.
And so that's the problem. We're using like a square peg for a round hole when it comes time to evaluate the risk of these devices.
Yep. There's a ton of examples on here, and literally we could spend all our time talking about examples, but I thought this was interesting because it's ransomware, which we know is running rampant and afflicts a lot of people, right? So that maybe you can just elaborate a little bit on the challenges and, you know, how to address these issues.
Yeah, I mean, the point here related to ransomware is we think of ransomware as coming in through phishing emails that people click on and impact an enterprise, right? I've handled like 200 ransomware cases. I've had my fair share of weekends and holidays stolen from me by ransomware threat actors. But what I think is important to recognize here is there have been multiple examples from incredibly large manufacturers that we all know. It doesn't do anyone any good for me to call them out right now. You can go Google it on your own. But like companies who make firewalls, companies who make VPNs, companies who make insanely important critical things that are always connected to the internet and that are always on, because the attackers understand that the software components that are on these devices are incredibly old, possess well-known vulnerabilities. They can easily go find exploits that can exploit those vulnerabilities, and then they can gain access to a device that will have admin rights that they can then pivot to into the enterprise, or encrypt that device, or launch ransomware attacks from that device, however they fit. And who's looking?
Right.
What monitoring do you have on your firewall if someone compromises it?
Right.
The answer is none.
So the irony is not lost in that example, but it's true. It's very true. And the firewall is intended to be a security device, and yet there are vulnerabilities that exist by virtue of that. So
nothing's perfect, right?
Yeah, but this is a great. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I always go back to this, right? People, whenever people, I think some people are still surprised that like security companies can have vulnerabilities and like huge vendors have all these challenges. Listen, as long as human beings are writing software and human beings are imperfect, which I'm pretty sure is going to be forever, the software that they also output is not going to be perfect. And so this is just but no one has bothered looking at these devices and introducing the risks and vulnerabilities that exist here. And so that's why we are.
So the question that I would formulate out of this is, you know, our embedded devices, or firmware or OT devices or XIoT devices, is this the next kind of foothold for ransomware, you think?
I mean, the data certainly seems to show that. And here's the reason I think. Here's one of the reasons. Say you have a very well implemented spam filter. Like, let's just make up some names. Like, you're using Proofpoint, right? Which is a great one. And you have like CrowdStrike or SentinelOne XDR on all your endpoints, and it's configured appropriately. You're doing vulnerability scanning. You have a program that is in place that you're addressing your vulnerabilities in some kind of reasonable way. Now, that's like kind of table stakes. Well, if you're doing all of those things, and I know a lot of people are probably like, well, everyone isn't doing that, Tom. That's hard, blah, blah. Okay. But I think people are doing a better job than most people think, actually. Right. If you're an attacker, to get a phishing email through that spam filter where someone clicks on it, that code executes on an endpoint and then encrypts the systems and causes an incident. I mean, obviously it's still happening. It's not like it's rare. But I think some attackers are like, why am I going through all that trouble when I can just attack something that is directly connected to the internet all of the time, and that has software vulnerabilities or firmware vulnerabilities, because components that are in that firmware are 5 years, 10 years, sometimes 20 years old. There's no endpoint security. There's no monitoring.
Right.
Once you're on, no one can tell. So
nobody's looking essentially. Yeah. So it's not just leaving the door unlocked, it's leaving it wide open. Right. So I think so. I want to talk about supply chain a little bit because, you know, software supply chain attacks have been pretty pervasive recently, and firmware is software, right? So how do you manage like getting updates, and, you know, how concerned should we be about the supply chain from a software standpoint?
yeah, I mean, I say that all the time, that firmware is just software with an F. Obviously, there are differences between firmware and software, but at the end of the day, it's just software components that have been basically saved into a single image that are then, you know, placed on something that interacts directly with the hardware. But I mean, so you have two kinds of supply chain problems is the way I think about it. You have the technical supply chain problems, which are like, is code being written in a secure way? Is it going through some kind of secure software development lifecycle? Are people analyzing open source components for vulnerabilities and risks? Like all of that kind of normal stuff. And then you have something known as like operational supply chain risk, which is where did this code come from? Who wrote it? What country are they from? How old is the code? How many contributors? If it's open source, does this code have? When's the last time it was updated? So those things can all inform the operational risk of the supply chain risk here that we have. But I mean, SolarWinds was a great example here, right? Where you have to be looking not only at source, but also after you've written the source and compiled the code. This is especially true when it comes to firmware. The number of companies we've talked to who don't properly understand that, like the compilers they use will oftentimes strip away some of the security controls that they believe are going to be in place once a firmware image has been compiled, right? And that's because that's what modern compilers do. They go and they look and say, okay, you have this binary protection turned on. However, we see that this binary is trying to execute this other thing, so we need to strip that off. Otherwise, it's not going to work. So you didn't know that unless you take a look after all of that code has been compiled after the fact. So you really need to have a comprehensive way to do all of these things.
Cool. And we do have a question that came in: which industries are most at risk for an IoT breach? And we are going to talk about this a little later in the webinar. So maybe I'll just I'll let us wait for that, and we'll get through a couple more slides because we're going to talk specifically about that thing. I wanted to mention this. So we did a webinar. It was towards the end of last year. I think it was in December. Rockwell Automation and Cleveland Clinic both participated. We talked specifically about Executive Order 14028, which the concept of an SBOM was very pervasive in that, and zero trust networks and various different things. But it was really about protecting our nation basically from a cyber attack. And so anybody that does business with the government this applied to, or critical infrastructure, right? But my sentiment then and now is that, it's never going to be less regulated of an industry. And so we're going to see these things probably permeate across all industries and be part of, various different frameworks and compliance requirements and those kind of things. But from an executive order standpoint, Tom, are there any executive orders that you know of that are specifically geared toward XIoT and really, require that you improve your security in that space?
Well, I mean, what the most important, like the cybersecurity executive order that came out last May, talks a ton about is like software transparency and visibility as it relates to SBOM, which applies to everything. It doesn't necessarily call it XIoT because number one, that term didn't exist yet, but it does call out firmware. I want to say like 11 times. I can't remember. I'd have to go back and look again. But it does call out, it also lays out like what its definition of critical software is, which by the way is like everything.
Yeah. Right.
Browsers and operating systems. And it's like, okay, well.
Why would you write a piece of software that wasn't critical? That's what I'm thinking, right?
Yeah, like, I don't know, maybe a dating app. Yeah, so they don't call out these devices in particular, I suppose, but they call out the things that underpin everything that they exist on. And so in terms of like when the federal government, I mean, we're working with elements of the federal government, they need SBOMs for the devices that they are looking to buy, right? That's what they're asking for that already. As a result of this.
What is an SBOM? Can you tell us what that is?
Sure. Yeah. So an SBOM is just a software bill of materials. So what a software bill of materials does is just give you basically a way to think about it from an analogy perspective is an ingredients list that of what is in a particular software component or application or operating system or firmware image, whatever it is. And it gives it down to you like in a tree. Oh, here's all the dependencies. Here's all the libraries. Here are the versions. And then depending on that software bill of materials standard that you're using, the two primary ones are Cyclone DX and SPDX. There's other fields you can put in there like vulnerability and exploitability or what like component licenses are present there like GPL or MIT and things like that. So you can ensure that you're not violating any like regulatory or compliance or copyright problems whenever you use open source code, things like that.
Cool. We're going to talk some more about that later. So I put some questions together and I want to start with here, but I thought maybe if you can elaborate a little bit more on NetRise specifically and what you do, because I think it's so important to really understand that there's a tool available to do these things, right?
Yeah, we certainly think so. Yeah, so I mean, on the slide, you've laid out a handful of the features and capabilities that our platform can provide. So this is all as a result of doing this kind of work for many years, not just me, but the rest of the team. The way that this problem is generally solved still is via a lot of consulting engagements, which obviously have their place, but they lack an important component, which you see in the upper left box there, continuous monitoring and analysis. And we used to do the same thing. We would do a device assessment for a company. We'd send them a PDF report. They'd say, this is great. You guys did exactly what we wanted. Thank you very much. But 90 days later, how valuable is that report?
Right. One day later, now how valuable is that report, right? So
you can certainly make that argument, right? And so if you're not continuously, this would be like the equivalent of installing an antivirus agent on your desktops for a week and then going back and uninstalling it and being like, well, we didn't find anything, so we must be good. Like no one does that. So it's like, why are we treating these devices differently? And the reason we're treating them differently is not because I think we don't care or we don't understand that there's risk associated with them. I don't think it's either one of those things. What I think is that there have not been solutions because this is a significantly harder problem. I can talk for 100 hours about the challenges in building a scalable firmware analysis platform. Woo! I mean, it's not the same thing as dealing with a Windows operating system or not the same thing as even just dealing with normal software. So that's why these solutions have been, late or essentially non-existent in the market. It's also really important. People get super excited about vulnerabilities. Great. That's fine. Like they're super important. Are they the most important thing we do? Like maybe, but what I like to highlight is like we provide holistic risk visibility, not just vulnerabilities. Here's weak credentials. Here's expired certificates. Here's scenarios where we found both public and private keys in your firmware, which isn't good. Here we found all these binaries that don't have binary protection mechanisms, like et cetera, et cetera. It's not just here are the vulnerabilities. We're not a vulnerability scanner. That's just one feature that the platform is capable of. Like it's a real platform that has an API and you can put data in and take data out and like do whatever kind of fun things you want to do. So, the compliance adherence piece that's in here is around like open source, the licenses aspect. We're also putting in security configurations as well. So you'll be able to measure your XIoT devices against things like DISA-STIGs and other frameworks and compliance issues or standards that you want to adhere to. And then, the querying, being able to ask questions of this data at scale is super, super important. So if you want to understand, for example, where is log4j, or maybe not where it is, do I have log4j on
Right.
any of these XIoT devices? Well, how the hell do you answer that question right now?
Right.
The answer is you don't.
That's right.
You reach out to all your manufacturers and you ask them nicely, and hopefully they
Do you
can
use this,
give the
right?
answer.
Yeah.
And in a lot of cases they can't. And there's good reasons for that, and there's bad reasons for that. It just depends on who we're talking about. But why are we not taking control of a device that we own and operate and have accepted the risk for?
Right.
The manufacturer does not own the risk of this device after you buy it, period. So that idea is it's 100% false. So why don't we have visibility into these devices so we can appropriately manage that risk?
Yep. I think Log4j is a great example because there are so many dependencies involved, right? So like my clients, I had my clients reaching out to me saying, are you affected by this, right? I'm like, what about my third parties? I'm a third party to my clients, but I have third parties also, and they have third parties and they have third parties. So how far are you going to take this, right? So why not just discover if you're inflicted and be able to answer that question based on what you have, instead of, depending on this phone game of and this dependency kind of food chain and those kind of things. But in any event, I get it. So it's a very comprehensive package. Lots of things. Who is this for? I mean, who is the package for?
Yeah. So, I think one of the things that's fairly unique about us is that we are approaching both the people building the devices and the people using the devices. Those are different use cases. Those are different personas. They are different, go to market and buying cycles and all of that. But to me, they're both super important. And I think that's one of the really important things. So you can see here, I mean, these are some of like the key verticals in terms of like healthcare, power and utilities, device manufacturers that obviously exist. But the reality is it's everyone. So if you look at like, you have enterprise there. So we have a private equity firm as a client. We have a university as a client. We have a consulting firm as a client. Like everyone has these devices.
Right.
So it's our job to go in and make them understand, like I mentioned before, the pushback is not around that they don't understand that there's a problem here and that they would like to solve it. It's the problem exists, or the challenge has been rather, that they have been totally unaware that a solution exists in the market. And so that's where we come in. And quite frankly, there's very few things that a founder of a startup can hear that are better than the only reason we haven't bought anything is because there hasn't been anything in the market. Well, here we are. So, that's it's kind of a wonderful place to be. And, each of these devices, the device types over here, some of those are very focused on particular verticals, like obviously medical devices. You're not going to find medical devices in a insurance company or something, right? Or in like a power and utility company necessarily. You're going to find them in hospitals and healthcare facilities and things like that. Same thing with embedded systems in vehicles. You're typically going to find those at automotive and plane and train manufacturers. Right. There's exceptions, but that's generally the case. But in terms of IoT, ICS, and telecommunications equipment, horizontal problem, total horizontal problem. Like we can have a conversation around, well, what about ICS? Like, isn't that overwhelmingly power and utilities and manufacturing and oil and gas and mining? And I'm like, you just named 5 verticals.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. Well, the water plants,
I guess
wastewater treatment facilities, right?
Yeah,
so
I mean,
we've got tons of examples of water plants that have been attacked and all kinds of notifications. Well, I did find some of this interesting, like a telecom industry. You wouldn't think of that, like, having these devices in play, but they do, right? So is there any one industry that you think is more susceptible to a data breach than another one in direct response to this question?
I don't think that's the right way to think about the question. I mean, to me, it's, if you have IoT, how are you thinking about securing it? if I had to like think of a particular industry that has this problem more than others, I think it would be the obvious ones like healthcare and like critical infrastructure kinds of things. I mean, this is an enormous problem for the DoD in a really, really big way. But I mean, if you look at like telecommunications companies, I mean, that's their entire existence. I mean, think about the infrastructure it makes up 4G and 5G that is out there. It's beyond comprehension. How many devices that they have that are out there running all of the bandwidth and telecommunications systems that we all use on a daily basis. So yeah, I mean, to me, it's not necessarily like, I think that people get really hung up about being targeted in attacks. And does that happen? Obviously. But I think generally speaking, a lot of attacks are fairly opportunistic. And so it's less about, am I in a vertical that is going to be especially targeted because I have these devices, and more so, do the devices I have introduce vulnerabilities and risks that I'm not aware of?
Right.
That's the way I would think about it.
Do I have a weak link? And that's
the answer is yes.
That's what you should be thinking about. Yeah. Yeah. So I wanted to set this next segment up with, we posted a blog, but it came from your site, Tom, and your folks. But I love the way it starts with a famous philosopher quote, right? So that if there's a black box opened in the woods and nobody's around to see inside of it, are there vulnerabilities?
Yeah,
I mean, that is a metaphor for this challenge, right? So I think it's pretty cool from that perspective. But I want to just get to the meat of this. Like, that blog goes on, and it's posted on our website for those of you in the audience. If you want to see it and just read it, there's a great example in there, about this inside out approach and why it's so important. But that's my question to you, Tom. Why is it important anyway?
Yeah. So I mean, what we wrote in this blog was, we took a traditional vulnerability scanner. Doesn't matter who it is, they all would have basically given the same results. We scanned an IoT device and we found 5 vulnerabilities that we could just find on the internet, easily download and just upload. I mean, anyone can do this. We found 5 vulnerabilities, like I mentioned. We then looked up this device in the National Vulnerability Database, and we found 2 vulnerabilities. No overlap between the 5 found from the vulnerability scanner and the 2 that we identified in the National Vulnerability Database. Now, that's an entirely separate problem that I can talk about.
Shouldn't the CVE folks use Google and find those?
I can talk about the challenges with the NVD for the rest of my life. And then we uploaded the firmware of this IoT device into our platform and found 142 vulnerabilities. So does that mean your vulnerability scanner is bad or stupid or whatever? No, not at all. It means it's doing what it's supposed to be doing. It's like the Albert Einstein quote, right? If you ask a fish to climb a tree, it's going to think it's stupid. That's not what fish do. This is not what vulnerability scanners do. They can't do authenticated scans against these devices. They can't install an agent to get a deeper look at a device, and they're running applications and services like they can on like a Windows machine or something. So what we do is we take the firmware, upload it, and rip it apart. So we get a much, much better view from the inside out of the various software components that are underpinning these devices. So and by the way, we want to and are partnering with these kinds of companies because they give us the outside in and we give them the inside out. And so with that combination, you get a very, very good, holistic and comprehensive data set representing what's going on with these devices.
Yep. 142 versus 5 is a huge disparity, right? So, I mean, how do you account for that? Other than, I get the outside in versus inside out paradigm, but how do you account for that level of disparity? And those vulnerabilities, are they exploitable?
What we have found in our early data set is that roughly 20% of all vulnerabilities we've identified have exploits, that they're exploitable and have exploits available out there. you know, imagine standing outside of a house and trying to determine how many people are inside the house. Well, that's going to be pretty hard. And then go inside the house and figure out how many people are in there. Well, that's going to be much easier. You have access to information in a different way. So that is us. We have access to information in a different way than these other solutions. It doesn't mean they're bad, like I mentioned, right? Does it mean that the person outside the house is stupid because he can't guess how many people are inside the house? Of course not. It just means he doesn't have the, he or she doesn't have the right viewpoint or visibility to make a better educated decision. All they're going to be able to do is be like, okay, I see somebody standing in the window. I think I saw 2 people walking around downstairs. Like that's their perspective is much more narrow than somebody being on the inside. So.
Right. I was thinking about, I just recently watched Home Alone. I have young kids, and
nice.
He put these cardboard figures on. So anybody outside the house would have thought there was a party going on. There were
yeah.
A lot of people. There were a lot of people, and there was really only one. So
that's right.
Tell us how this platform that you talked about, NetRise Turbine. Tell us how it works.
Yeah, I mean, so the approach is, we can come in and help identify the assets and devices that exist in your environment. Most organizations we've talked to already have something doing that for them, whether it's a vulnerability scanner or a dedicated like asset inventory tool, like an Armis or a Dragos or a Clarity or whatever. We figure out what devices you have. We figure out which devices we would like to acquire the firmware from. We get the firmware, we upload it to our platform. It does its thing. We have a full-blown API, so you can send data to a SIM. We can generate alerts. We can integrate it with other technologies. Say you're a manufacturer, we can integrate it into like your CI/CD pipeline with like Jira or Jenkins or whatever. Say you have a ticketing system like ServiceNow, we can integrate with that, whatever it is. So that's once again, I could talk about this forever, but that's a good kind of high-level overview of how it works and how we get data in there.
Yep. I had another view to highlight this, but it talks a little bit more about where you get the data from and those kind of things. And maybe you can elaborate a little bit on this.
Yeah, I mean, so another like really big differentiator for the way we do things here is we view this as a data problem. We don't necessarily view this as a firmware problem. It's just like the first set of data that we are solving this problem for. So a lot of people here came from Cylance or Tanium or like the NSA. We have a really, really strong data science and machine learning team here that has built some of the most effective machine learning models that have ever been created from a cybersecurity perspective. Yep. So we're taking that same set of expertise and experience and applying it to this problem. Now, they're different problems, right? We're not interested in like finding malware in firmware necessarily, because that's pretty rare. It does happen, but we do check for malware, but we don't need to spend all of our time with like some super sophisticated machine learning model to do that in firmware. What's much more important is how do we do a significantly better job at like component identification and vulnerability validation and correlating the data from all of these different firmware images so that we can glean really important data points at scale. So when you look at even like what we call like a firmware bill of materials or an FBOM, that exists. You have identifying secrets. You have a file browser that is in as long as the firmware has a file system. So like a real-time operating system does not typically, but software licenses all of this. So what this does a good job of highlighting is the holistic approach that we take. This is not just about vulnerabilities, like I mentioned. So if you look over there on the left, you see vulnerability identification. It's one thing. It's just one thing we do. All of this other stuff are all aspects and components that feed into the platform. So, and a lot more to come here. What you don't see on here is like dynamic analysis. You don't see on here like a lot of the reporting stuff that we've added recently. We've really upped our game from like a search perspective. We're doing vulnerability prioritization now. We're bringing in threat intelligence information for enrichment. So there's a whole lot of fun stuff happening.
Yep, awesome. So I wanted to open it up to take. We got we got a bunch of questions here, so I want to open it up for audience questions. And it looks like there are some good ones too, but I'll start with this. Does NetRise help you meet compliance requirements? I know compliance adherence is listed on here as a feature, but
Yeah.
do you do that, and how?
Yeah. So I mean, obviously depends what compliance framework we're talking about. But say you're a device manufacturer and you want to understand, am I going to be violating any open source, copyright or whatever issues with licensing? We can identify those for you. Say you're on the enterprise side, and if you look at like the NIST security controls, or if you look at, there's firmware and like asset identification and software transparency are basically part of just about every compliance framework these days.
Right.
And so the answer is we 100% provide you with security controls that would meet various compliance frameworks. I'd have to know what they are specifically so I could talk about like what controls.
Let's talk about CMMC a little bit, because there's been some restructuring around that program, and there's a NIST counterpart to it, if you will, and but it's relatively new, and it applies to a pretty broad stroke of folks, right? So that's like how would we leverage this insight to help us comply with CMMC requirements?
Well, I know there's a handful of controls there around having asset visibility and having a clear understanding of the software components that exist in your environment and how risky they are or they are not. I think with the latest version of CMMC, they added like 2 or 3 controls specifically around firmware, things like ensuring you're on the latest firmware version and ensuring that, you like validate the authenticity and integrity of the firmware and things of that nature. But also you have the whole, DHS a handful of years ago came out with something called CDM, continuous diagnostic and monitoring. This is back when I was at DOE. But the point is, this idea of CDM is so critical, but we don't apply it to these devices in the same way. We might say something like, oh, well, I'm using ARMUS, so I'm continuously monitoring. Like, no, like at the network layer potentially, but that would be like, once again, I'm a big fan of analogies and comparisons here. That would be like saying, hey, I have a network-based intrusion detection sensor covering my laptops, so I don't need antivirus. No one says that.
Right.
No one on the planet says that. So why do we say that with these other devices that make up at least 100% of the known to exist attack surface, and in most cases greater than 100% of the known attack surface, but we don't provide the same visibility into those things.
Yep.
And like I said, we know. I think we know the reason, right? It's because it was really hard to do, and blah 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 blah. And so here we are. But
yep. I'll keep moving through these questions. Tom, are there any frameworks that might help with device security?
Yeah, you have, NIST came out with a cool one a while back, like the firmware resiliency guide. That has a bunch of great stuff in it. Like Underwriters Laboratory and the FDA have like, what is it, UL 2900-1, which is, I might be slightly off here, but that's primarily for medical devices, I think, but can be used for all kinds of, it applies to any kind of device. But I think it was primarily written for the medical device community. I know like NERC SIP has a handful of good controls around and sets of standards and frameworks that.
Yep. ISA IEC 62443 also really addresses device security.
That's a great one.
But I agree with you. Historically it's just been completely ignored, in my opinion, right? So there are a lot of manufacturers that are churning out products and not really caring so much about vulnerabilities and exploitability and all those things. I think there's more focus now on it than ever, and that's probably because from an attack surface standpoint, it's people are there. I think there was a slide that I saw, Tom, that that you had talked about before, but IT/OT convergence is a big thing. It's been around for decades, and it probably means something different today, right? Plugging an XIoT device into the IT network, but the cross IT to OT or OT to IT attacks is huge. I mean, Colonial Pipeline is a good example of that. So I think a lot of stuff going on in this space. So again, I'm very grateful for your platform, because it just, these are things that people just don't know about. And, you know, the ignorance is bliss card is not a good one to play in this case, because if you get breached, you get breached, right? Or if you get shut down, or if somebody dies, or if a control room blows up, or, you know, a patient in a healthcare system, you know, has a challenge. I'll keep going through these questions. Can you explain SBOM a little bit more, and who has to do one?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of who has to do one, which I think is the most important aspect, the manufacturers should be creating an SBOM for any piece of software that they write. So if you're writing software at your organization, you should be doing it too. And I think, you know, one of the things that's also propelled SBOM to be a much more important thing is every company is writing software these days. So every company has developers. And so anyone writing software should be writing their SBOMs as well. Now, people get really hung up on like writing an SBOM for all this like legacy stuff is really hard. I don't disagree. But at some point we have to draw a line in the sand, right? And say like, okay, moving forward, we're going to do this. And there's tooling in place that makes generating SBOMs not hard, not expensive, and just part of the normal process. Now, if we want to have a conversation about like, well, for me to go back and create an SBOM for this thing, blah, blah, like that is old, like, fine. Okay, that's fine. Like, let's do the best we can. But at some point, we have to make a decision to just be like, all right, from this day forward, we're going to do SBOMs and here's how we're going to do it, blah, blah, blah. Like, we have the technology. Like, this idea that like, there's just no way to do this is just totally false. So anybody writing software is really the answer.
I use as a metaphor a lot of times, and this is for more traditional software development life cycles, but you know, there's a manager somewhere tapping a developer on the shoulder saying, are you done yet? Are you done yet? Are you done yet? And this developer's like, oh shit, I'm not even close. And you know, date pickers are a great example, right? Nobody's going to write the code for a date picker. You know, you have to format the calendar and, you know, the days and all this stuff. Nobody's going to write that. You're just going to look on Google, and you know, you might have a personal preference for something or various different things, but those libraries and objects, that's what you're looking for. And you happen to be looking for it in firmware. So this is a good lead into the next question. From a software development lifecycle standpoint, how similar is firmware to you know, I'll say a more traditional software development lifecycle?
It depends what kind of device you're putting it on. So let's imagine, because if it's firmware for like an automotive device, you have significant safety critical things that need to occur. If you're writing firmware for a security camera, you kind of just YOLO it. You know, you just write a bunch of software and hope for the best. So you know, if you're writing firmware that's on a programmable logic controller, that's going to be used in weapons manufacturing or at nuclear facilities, things like that. The amount of scrutiny on that is significantly higher. The amount of like safety and like regression testing that has to occur is significantly higher. So it really depends, like I guess it always does. But you know, if we take out those like super safety critical things, the biggest difference is like how are these things interacting with the hardware? Because that's like the number one purpose most of the time. Or like a lot of the proprietary code is coming in there. So it is definitely a different process that requires like a special set of skills, because you might be writing like bare metal firmware directly that needs to, you know, run right on a chip or something like that. So, and I think that's the problem, is that we've brought a lot of software developers into the embedded software development space.
Right.
That don't necessarily, they're writing software like they're writing software. So whereas That's
Right.
not what we're doing exactly.
Machine languages and, like C and C++ are traditionally used for firmware, right? So most applications are developed in some kind of, I'll say, lighter or, or more mature. Well, I don't know if mature is the right word, but like the .NET framework, for example, there's a component for everything really, and
Yep.
Oracle has it. So I think the software development life cycles are very similar. So that the principles and practices, this is where I would go with it. There's the principles and practices of, if you're writing a core application to collect data from multiple sources, it's the same as the software that you would write that lives on the device from a principle and practices standpoint. So in other words, DevSecOps should apply in either case, right? And I think it's really about understanding your risks and those kind of things, right? Just fleshing out that visibility. And again, that's what your platform looks to do. I'm not going to get to all of the questions. I know we're kind of running out of time, and I have a few things that I want to just get through here. But and one of them is for the attendees on the webinar. So we put together a special offer, and part of it is, helping companies create an SBOM, right? So are there specific formats to use for that, Tom?
Yeah, Cyclone DX and SPDX are the two big ones. And we can export a software bill of materials in both of those. So
yeah. So if anybody's interested in seeing what a software bill of materials look like, and specifically for your devices, please just reach out to me or Paul Mancini. I put both email addresses on here, or actually, Tom, I should have put your email address too, but send it to me, and we'll enact this program and make sure that you get an SBOM for your software and those kind of things. I want to talk about some of the upcoming things we have. So this month in May, be traveling to the West Coast and talking about AI Med, which again, from a medical device standpoint, there's a lot of this XIoT devices in play here, but AI Med is really about the infrastructure required to create artificial intelligence, machine learning applications that are beneficial to healthcare. We're going to talk specifically about cyber. So I'll be speaking at that event as well. And we're going to talk specifically about cyber security and healthcare as it relates to AI. So that's a good thing. I'll also be part of a panel coming up at Cleveland Marshall this month. And Cleveland Marshall puts on a cybersecurity show every year. So we're talking at that again and sponsoring that event. But if you're interested in attending, we have and actually for AI Med too, if you're interested in attending, if you're a healthcare company, we have a discount code, but feel free to leverage that for the Cleveland Marshall program cybersecurity event. It's 50% off. For AI Med, it's 10% off. Part of the Northern Ohio HIMSS chapter, we are sponsoring that, and there are a couple events coming up. So we'll post more information about that, and I think we're going to do a webinar or a breakfast series with them as well. So that's lots of stuff. Any closing remarks, Tom? Where would you go if there's something for the audience that some piece of information that you have that you think everybody should know, or how would you just kind of wrap?
I think what I would say is, if you follow us on LinkedIn, we put out a fair amount of content. We put out at least a blog a week. Sometimes we put out even more than that. We'll be putting this on our YouTube channel. If you want to go to our website, it's netrise.io. If you want to hit me up on LinkedIn, shoot me a message, all of that. But I mean, let's get some visibility and identify the actual risks associated with your devices, and we can certainly help do that.
Awesome. Yeah, and for me, it would just be this is a huge problem from an attack surface standpoint, especially, and I think the bad guys are starting to leverage it. We're seeing an increase in attacks for OT devices or IoT, XIoT devices pretty pervasively, and we're continuing to be in this trend of proliferating devices, right? There are just tons of them, and more to come, right? So this smart toaster, whether it exists or not, it's not that far off. It's not far-fetched from an idea standpoint. So there are a lot of things at play in this, and it's another risk that we need to be protected against. And none of us wants to experience a data breach and those kind of things. So let's do what we can. Thank you so much, Tom, for joining us today, and your insights have been incredible, and I really appreciate you joining us. And I just want to say thank you to the audience for sharing your time with us today, and yeah, let us know if we can do anything to help you identify or address these challenges. Thanks.
Awesome. Thanks a lot. See you guys.